It's just kind of one of these things of how the actual prescription use of it wasn't considered in the initial targeting. We already live in a trans antagonistic society, and therefore we're kind of like left out of that and how it's kind of collateral damage. I see a lot of parallels in Sesta Fosta with criminalization of sex work and how more difficult it is to navigate that, where it just ends up the person being criminalized.
You're listening to Narcotica, a podcast giving you the straight dope about drugs and the people who use them.
Hello, Narcotica listeners. It's Zach Siegel, your co-host. Thanks for tuning in to today's show, where we'll be talking about testosterone. Testosterone is on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. It's prescribed for a number of important reasons, from sexual dysfunction to boosting low production levels, and it's also used in gender-affirming therapy. Yet, for a variety of reasons that we'll get into, testosterone and the tools used to inject it are criminalized in a way that defies all rationality. Like with so many drugs we cover on this show, restrictive and punitive laws carry serious consequences, especially for marginalized people. And like with so many of these laws, they are rationalized by misinformation and fear. Laws restricting testosterone purport to prevent athletes from using the hormone to unfairly enhance their performance. Of course, athletes still find ways around these laws. Other justifications paint testosterone as a dangerous chemical, one that induces toxic rage and violence. A silly character, played by comedian Sacha Baron Cohen, jokingly said, "The world's most dangerous chemical weapon is testosterone." That kind of humor really does skewer the nonsense people think about this drug. But that nonsense carries real-world impact, especially for gender-variant people, especially for transmasculine people. Testosterone impacts people's bodies differently, but it can help alleviate gender dysphoria. The hormone can facilitate the growth of body hair, deepen one's voice, and redistribute weight and increase muscle mass in the face and body. Testosterone can lead to significant improvements in quality of life and reduce mental health conditions like anxiety and depression. And yet, again, outlandish fears led to restrictive laws, which led to criminalization and barriers to its access. It's a story of bad drug policy that many of you listeners are by now familiar with. To talk about all of this, we have a great interview lined up that will roll in just a moment. Before doing so, if you don't already, now's a great time to subscribe to our Patreon to show your support and appreciation for the show. Go to patreon.com/narcotica. We are 100% listener funded. That means we are independent, free from marketers and advertisements. As always, thanks so much for listening and supporting us. All right, let's roll the show. With me today is my co-host, Troy Farah, beaming in from California. What's up, Troy?
Hey, how's it going? Snowed today.
Same, but I'm in Chicago, so that makes more sense. So on today's episode, we're going to be covering a very important topic that, is really underreported and doesn't get enough attention. And to talk about it, we have a very special guest, journalist Adryan Corcione, who covers drugs, policing, and other topics in harm reduction. So Adryan, welcome to Narcotica.
Thanks, Zach. Really happy to be here with you and Troy. I'm really excited.
Yeah, awesome. So I think to get things started, what kind of brought us all together is a recent piece you wrote for Filter, is that right?
Yeah, it's a long form piece published in December called The Criminalization of Testosterone and How It Affects, I don't know the official title, but how it affects gender variant people. So, transgender men, intersex people, non binary people, anyone under the gender variance umbrella who takes testosterone for gender forming hormone replacement therapy.
Yeah, like I think it's totally in our wheelhouse to talk about chemicals, like quote unquote drugs that our own bodies produce. And I mean, we talk about endorphin and serotonin and dopamine. We talk about all these drugs, these critical neurotransmitters in our bodies, and they're yeah, really critical to human life. And testosterone is right up there and actually has a lot of interesting intersections with the opioid crisis, which we can get into, with obviously issues regarding trans people and those undergoing, transitions in their gender. And so, to kind of kick things off, I think people listening probably have no idea why the government would care about this drug. Like, why would it be so strictly controlled? Why would there be all this gatekeeping around this drug? Maybe that's a good place to start.
The history is pretty intriguing and I think unexpected in a way that gender variant people weren't necessarily discussed or really considered with how initial laws to criminalize testosterone targeted cis male athletes going back to the 90s with testosterone as an anabolic steroid, combating steroid abuse in competitive sports.
Well, yeah, just bring us to today. Like, it started with sports, which seems like this really small, tiny thing. Like, how often do people dope with this stuff? I don't even want to use the word dope, but how often people use this drug, this hormone to enhance their athletic ability? Like, that seems like a really weird, tiny, very rare occurrence. And then the government has all these rules that are extended beyond that. And how do people get caught up in that now?
So I think what is used as a performance enhancer, I think within like the underground testosterone market, it's one of those drugs that can be bought and purchased online, similar to research chemicals. And I think it's more so like amateur athletes that are affected by this now. Although I will say I'm not a sports person. However, I think it's kind of transitioned from this very organized sports and how the initial legislation and law in 1990 was proposed that criminalized testosterone and put it as a scheduled drug under the Controlled Substance Act. And then later in 2004, another law put forth by Joe Biden, of course, kind of amplified these criminalizations. And even though there's no doubt that like performance enhancers are used, but it is a bit of an arbitrary occurrence for particularly testosterone and the type of testosterone that, people access for gender affirming care. They're used in different ways and also it's monitored differently. And it's just kind of one of these things of how the actual prescription use of it wasn't considered in the initial targeting that I think goes overlooked, and how we already live in a trans antagonistic society and therefore we're kind of like left out of that, and how it's kind of collateral damage and kind of puts us even further in the margins for people who are accessing testosterone for gender affirming care.
Okay, that makes sense. What are some of the ways that specifically that testosterone is criminalized? Like, and what are some of the things that can happen to someone who is caught with testosterone or syringes? I really like the example you had in your story, if you want to use that one.
Yeah. And I think too, this falls under stigma for particularly injection drug users, where even though it can be a prescription, It still falls under that stigma that you need to have to get needles and syringes, where just going to the pharmacy, like I personally argue with the pharmacy to get the right syringes, because another thing too is that you need a longer syringe to draw the substance because it's thicker than what is injected into you. But kind of scaling back to the story I included of San Francisco, a non-binary person on a road trip coming back to their home in New Mexico. They were in a small town in Texas, just taking a break from driving at night, pulled over in a small town, and then quickly were kind of escalated. Police intervened and being like, hey, what are you doing here? An outsider in a small town, I guess, was suspicious, to the point where their car was searched, the prescription testosterone that was in their name and the syringes were mistaken, I think initially for an heroin, but then once it was just kind of a confusion. And I think that's kind of about, police aren't exactly experts in gender, no matter how much training they have. And it's very representative that not only did they end up in jail, but they were in a cell with two people who were drug users, who were injection opioid users. So I think it's kind of that there's a lot of adjacencies, even though that it's not necessarily the same thing, of course. And that was somebody who had a prescription, right? So the consequences are much more severe if these are obtained online, obtained in the underground market. And also there are health consequences of navigating hormone therapy without the supervision of a doctor and without your blood being monitored.
Yeah, like, I mean, one thing that sticks out to me is, like, why testosterone and not, say, like, estrogen is controlled. And so can you talk about, like, why testosterone specifically and not estrogen has this strict control? Because it's Schedule 3, right, which places it, like, next to, I think you mentioned in your piece, like, buprenorphine and ketamine. Like, these are psychoactive substances that are pretty strong and require doctors monitoring you. Like is there anything testosterone on, like, a pharmacokinetic type of level that places it in this, or is it like all drug scheduling where it's pretty dubious and fairly motivated by all kinds of politics and stigma?
Yeah, I think it's both. The scheduling is pretty arbitrary in itself. And in terms of, like, it's not a psychoactive substance, but with your hormone levels, it can be very dangerous to go so far where you're exceeding what is, quote, healthy, what is, quote, acceptable in your body. I don't really know what that would look like in a cis man. But for somebody who's transgender, like, there comes to a point where you have so much testosterone in your body that it creates back into estrogen, because your body is smart enough to know that, like, these are what the hormones that it needs, which is why anybody who's under the medical supervision who has a prescription, they do quarterly blood monitoring, and after a certain time, a period, I think a year, maybe two, that it's every 6 months. But these are regular check-ins with your doctors, undergoing, reviewing what progress is being made in your transition, but also if you've had any other side effects, because there are, like, reproductive side effects. And yeah, just the hormone regulates so many things in your body too. So, I mean, that, if I were to guess, I think it's just because it's such an evasive of a thing, whereas opposed, it can kind of affect your other bodily functions and your health in a way that other drugs don't necessarily mess with your hormones, even though that they can mess with other parts of your body. However, it's part of this kind of, like, larger arbitrary system where, sure, it's scheduled, and that's what is impactful now. But initially, the legislation proposed in 1990 Also establish penalties for physical trainers who persuade or induce individuals to possess or use testosterone. So I think that's a way of this two-sided criminalization where the actual person who's taking it is criminalized and can be persecuted as, a chemical user, as I don't know if drug user is the right way to describe somebody who's taking so I don't know. But also the coach or whoever, parent, guardian, who is administering testosterone is also criminalized in that way. But yeah, that's what I got. That's what I gather.
Yeah, it seems like it's a really complex thing to navigate sometimes. Some people can't go to a doctor for testosterone or hormone replacement therapy or gender affirming therapy for a variety of reasons. The big one being that healthcare is really inaccessible in the United States. But I think it seems like syringe access programs have kind of stepped in and filled the gap in some of these areas. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And people who use testosterone definitely fall under this drug or injection drug user type of stigma, and also just this general lack of services, lack of availability. I think right now in the supply chain, there are shortages of different types of needles and syringes. And while also understanding, like, even though that there are preferred measures of the gauges of the needle, it is fairly flexible, even though there's an optimal measure of it. But I think just of what we know about LGBT people and the community at large, how it's more likely to experience drug addiction, not necessarily drug use, knowing that those two things often are kind of equated, but addiction is more prevalent in LGBT people, especially taking into account the systematic oppressions the barriers we have in employment, housing, all of that. And all of that is amplified too for transgender people, also for transgender people of color, who also are sex workers too. So I think needle exchanges and also transitioning and the more prevalence of overdose consumption sites have the real potential to fill gaps and needs in the community and possibly get people the care that they need, because it would be really awesome if LGBT clinics may do this, but in my experience, I have not seen it, but it'd be really cool if I could bring my needles to my doctor who is already gender affirming, right? Currently, that's not the case. I don't know. I'm sure I would hope that it would be in elsewhere. But I think there are unique needs the LGBT community has that a typical syringe centers may not have. However, I do recognize that these are also pretty monumental for coming out of AIDS era activism, and it's very critical to reduce the transmission of HIV to have access to clean needles.
Yeah, I'm not really sure like the exact statistics on rates of drug use among queer people, but I think that rates of isolation, depression, PTSD, anxiety, all of that are much higher, not because of any inherent aspects of being gender variant or something like that, but because we have this fucked up society that makes everybody feel like aliens, that they're less than or different or they don't fit in. I forget what the way you put it earlier, but I really liked that.
Trans antagonist,
yeah. So sometimes people reach for a chemical that will help, and I think that you pile on all the stigma from just criminalizing substances in general, and then you combine that with all the stigma against people that don't fit into this one box of heteronormacy. It's just like compounds everything and makes everything so much worse.
Absolutely. And I want to mention too that there are ongoing bills to criminalize transgender people, particularly transgender youth. The whole sports conversation is very relevant to how trans exclusionary radical feminists, conservatives, all of those allies that are against trans identity kind of weaponize testosterone against transgender women as if that is something to enhance performance, when really we're giving testosterone way too much credit. And the reason why I don't necessarily say testosterone is like like equivalent to a drug user, because these things aren't used recreationally in a way that you would drop acid. These are more pervasive in the sense of it's body image, body dysmorphia, how these things are not limited to gender variant people, although we're obviously very much affected by it on our daily existence. This is just like a symptom of patriarchy, capitalist patriarchy, of how we see ourselves and how we want to be seen. Which transgender people, of course, gender variant people, we know this very well, and this is a daily struggle. And I think for other identities, it might be hidden or like not really realized, the ways in which not only expected to perform your gender, but be perceived by others as the correct gender, and the behaviors and everything that goes along with that. And particularly for youth, I think it's in Texas. One of the most like harmful, violent pieces of legislation is how transgender kids, if it is revealed that they are transgender and that their parent caregiver is mediating, gender affirming services, that they're, a child abuser. Because according to the state, pursuing gender affirming care falls under child abuse, which is a totally outrageous claim. And I would argue that it's actually the opposite, to have a transgender child, continue to live life as the incorrect gender that they were assigned to. And it's very violent. And yeah, so the socio-political climate of what it is to be gender variant, to be not cis het, in this particular climate of what we know is already going on for teenagers and kids right now. It's really hard to be, just even if you're not trans, it's really hard to be a young person right now. So I can only imagine what it must be like for someone undergoing gender dysphoria during COVID that is so young and potentially trapped in an unsafe situation, and just the state being that much more violent in that young person's life.
Yeah, I think it's really important that we're talking about this the week that news broke about Texas Governor Greg Abbott, and I believe it's his attorney general. They're kind of, yeah, as you said, trying to legislate gender affirming care under the category of child abuse. And then, leading up to that was so much kind of panic about Leah Thomas, the Ivy League swimmer who is trans, and winning, and people all of a sudden caring about women's sports and kind of crying these like crocodile tears of, oh, these poor women swimmers are getting beat by a trans woman, and like calling into question all kinds of ideas about gender and biology, and creating all these really like nonsense debates. I mean, like one week it's crack pipes, and then the next week it's freakouts over trans youth, and it just seems like the right has this dartboard that they're just spin the wheel, throw the dart, and pick the kind of marginalized person to hold up as like the destruction of Western civilization, and yeah, like I just think trying to kind of set all this context and zoom out of it, it's like there's a reason why we all should be caring about this, that like it's drug users or trans kids or queer people or any it like there's no end. Like they'll come after you for some reason. Like it's just conceding on these things is such a setback. And I think, yeah, like hearing from someone like you right now, can you kind of speak to that this climate we're in? And it just reminds me of of all the kind of questions we wrestle with of like, how do we communicate about these things to the public and get them to care and see that like these issues actually affect everyone, you know?
I mean, when we talk about gender variant, we're talking about any gender identity that is not cis male or cis woman. And being somebody who's gender fluid, there are many otherwise cis people in my life that I get in on that they're not actually like aligned with their assigned gender, in the sense of they might not be transgender per se, but they don't adhere or subscribe to what it means to be a cis man or cis woman. And I think that's extremely more common than people who identify as cis know to be true. The idea of what is cisgender, male and female, is not what you think, and how many people actually adhere to these things, because I'm sure there are macho men. I'm sure that there are absolutely women who love being women, and that's not a bad thing. And there are people around you who may not identify as trans, who may not identify as something other than cis, that may or may not feel safe talking about it with the people around them. So it really starts with, I want to have a more clear action than creating a safer space. But I do think that challenging gender in your own life and being able to challenge it when we see these roles, when we see these biases play out, with your family, with your friends, these things are really important, because somebody that you might know and love might be searching of like, how do I know if I'm transgender on the internet? Because that's where everyone starts. It's where a lot of young people are absolutely starting, because the internet is so readily available, and there are so many more people who are visible.
Yeah. I want to kind of go back to the Texas news because it's so fresh. I mean, it just broke yesterday. And I don't think anybody really knows yet how this law will be implemented, or if it'll even get struck down. I wonder if somebody who's getting gender-affirming care, if they had testosterone or even estrogen, like if that would suddenly become a reason to prosecute somebody for child abuse. I mean, I don't know if we even know that. And I don't want to sound alarmist, but it does seem like a slippery slope from criminalizing the paraphernalia associated with gender variant healthcare to criminalizing actual trans people. And it feels like that's the end goal. There's all these different laws that are kind of pending in other states that are designed to demonize people that are gender variant. It's just crazy. And I think that talking about testosterone and how that's criminalized is just sort of like a small part of this bigger picture. But how do you feel about that? Do you think that this is sort of leading up to that? Like even something as small as, I don't want to say small, but criminalizing testosterone and putting this behind this ivory tower, I think could have much broader consequences on people's rights to exist.
Absolutely. And I think it is a criminalization of people. I see a lot of parallels in Sesta Fosta with how sex work became criminal, or the further amplification of the criminalization of sex work, and how more difficult it is to navigate that, where it just ends up the person being criminalized. I mean, I wonder what the legal consequences would be. So let's say you are a parent of a transgender boy who is under the age of 18 in a place like Texas, where suddenly it is illegal for you to pursue any type of a gender affirming care for your son. What if it's life or death? What if you seek the underground market for testosterone, and then you have this added criminalization, this added legal consequence upon what the state has just recently enacted? So are you prosecuted for testosterone underground administering that? Would it be the same criminalization if you had a young cis boy who did sports and you decided to give him testosterone to enhance his performance? Like, would that be the same? According to the books, it seems that. I'm not a lawyer. But obviously with this added criminalization of like what the state has proposed, it just makes you wonder of like how much more, like how worse it can get, based on how it's already difficult for people to access this, because it's not like, sure, there is a legal means of obtaining testosterone, especially in states with the informed consent model, which essentially is like you don't have to go prove to a mental health professional that you're trans or gender variant before you get gender affirming care. But let's say you are in a state where you have informed consent. There are tremendous bureaucratic barriers. It's like, for someone who's been on a stimulant prescription and testosterone, it is way easier for me to get a stimulant, and it's not easy to get a stimulant, you know? So, because it becomes of like, I don't know, fighting with the pharmacy, and also just like the pharmacy part of it brings so much stigma in. It's like how the trope within my community is like, all right, I'm going to the pharmacy to get my hormones, or I'm going to get dead named and misgendered, when it's, and for everyone, also estrogen too. So that in itself is like a very painful, uncomfortable situation at best, without even thinking about insurance of what they're willing to cover and what they're not, because these are barriers even for people within the community who are privileged.
Yeah, and I think that pushes people away.
And it's discouraging.
Yeah.
Yeah, like slightly tangential to this, but something I've been looking into is just the fact that people with opioid addictions, they, like, after prolonged use of opioids, testosterone levels are suppressed for all sorts of physiological reasons. And, one thing that's really not standard care and not part of addiction treatment, or say like if you're at a methadone clinic, like people don't have access or aren't even aware that their testosterone levels are being suppressed, and that this can have all kinds of detriments to their health. And this is, applies to men with opioid use disorder mostly, but that, over time, when their testosterone levels are well below the baseline, they have depression and can't concentrate and have all kinds of side effects from this. And yet it's just like that's just what happens when people take opioids. But very few people are aware of it, or are even told that there's treatments, like they can take a supplementary dose of testosterone to help them. And I just wonder, like, because of all these barriers and stigma, just like how much of that is contributing to people relapsing or having ongoing problems, that could be solved with a pretty simple fix, like in the form of a testosterone prescription. Like, has that come up on your radar at all in this topic? And like, to me, it kind of just seems like, because this drug has all this stigma attached and these strict controls, that they just create all these barriers, and it's people can't get it or don't even know that they might need it.
Something that came up after reporting, where people were eager to share experiences, because it's a topic I'm interested in going into depth more. I think I kind of just burned the surface of the many ways that this can impact people. And one of the experiences, voices I heard from, so in the context of psychiatric units, but I think this would also be true for addiction recovery centers, where there is, a doctor doing the medicine that is being prescribed while a patient is in that inpatient center at a time. And, that person's not your doctor that is familiar with your full health history. And that's, I think, Zach, of what you were saying is that is something that can absolutely be overlooked. But also for gender variant people who go to these inpatient services, it's under the discretion of that doctor whether or not that person receives gender affirming hormone therapy. And it's not uncommon for people to deny that. One of the voices I heard, it was a non-binary person on testosterone, and their friend in the unit who was on, they're a trans feminine non-binary person on a testosterone or blocker. And the person who I heard from, they weren't doing that much advocating for the testosterone because they kind of saw it as like a dead end, like why not bother or don't bother type of thing. But their friend, they advocated for themselves to please give me this medication. This is a routine thing. I'm non-binary, and like my regular doctor thinks this is medically necessary, but that doctor, whether it's ignorance or just holding views to antagonize transgender and gender variant people, I'm probably both, if you were to ask me. But yeah, either one of those things. That person has the power to deny people gender affirming care while they're seeking treatment for psychiatric reasons, to addiction recovery services, and similar mental health services while they are inpatient.
Maybe we could talk about some ways that we can start amending this issue. You do address this in the article about maybe rescheduling testosterone, moving it to a lower tier like 4 or 5, or maybe even removing it from the Controlled Substances Act entirely. And another question is, do you see any progress being made on this issue anywhere? I know we've been talking a lot about transphobic laws that are being passed or being proposed in certain places, but hopefully we're moving in the opposite direction in some other areas.
Yeah. When the article was published, I think it sparked a lot of conversation in the general drug policy sphere on Twitter, on social media, where a lot of people who I knew were grateful to read it because they hadn't considered it. And I'm thinking most of like cisgender people, that was kind of the point, because the part about this is that it is so known and so like matter of fact and general community knowledge to people who are on testosterone that it's mostly in the community. So part of the reporting that I think was successful was making it a conversation in like the drug policy space, and how gender variant people seeking testosterone hormone therapy who are on it face this kind of unique criminalization as collateral damage on a really arbitrary law. I mean, most drug laws are arbitrary, let's be honest, but this one is particularly pretty puzzling, I would say. And there isn't, I mean, what I've heard, it's such a hidden issue that I haven't really seen any calls for reform for it. I do think taking it off the Controlled Substance Act and descheduling it would make it much more accessible to get in like a medical context. And I'm also thinking about insurance too. They would make things easier. But I think kind of like this larger issue, especially understanding the ways that injection drug users have this stigma too, is just like the Controlled Substance Act doesn't really serve a purpose in actual, yeah, I mean, like that's the thing. It doesn't actually curb steroid use in sports. Like prohibition doesn't do anything to actually intervene when these things happen, because I think there is a pretty pervasive issue that actually is child abuse when somebody is like, a young person is taking a steroid that they probably don't have like a say in what they're, don't have a say in how that's going to be used. And I think that's very unique for sports and how it's a very money-driven industry. Most industries are. Don't know why I chose money-driven, but it's interesting how that can be flipped. But what I would like to see is abolish the DEA, abolish the Controlled Substance Act, All of these things don't do anything to actually improve the lives of people with addiction. They only harm them. And even for people who have the collateral damage, transgender people are still widely impacted by drug policing, just unrelated to testosterone, just based on the marginalizations that exist. I think there's a statistic out there. It's like one in every two, like I think it's like 47% of Black transgender people will be incarcerated at least once in their lifetime. So it's almost like one in two people.
Yeah. There was this pretty horrific story recently of this person named Juzima Goldring, 29-year-old black trans woman from Atlanta who was stopped by police for jaywalking, then falsely accused of possessing cocaine and spent more than 5 months in jail. And she was just awarded 1.5 million from a judge, which, maybe that'll get lowered or eaten up by attorney fees or whatever, but you still took away 5 months of this person's life on trumped up charges. And I think this demonstrates how especially terrible the drug war is on people of color and gender variant people.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's just this larger issue of policing and criminalization of gender variant people, anybody who isn't cis, and even, anybody, even cis people who are LGBT or, LGBT people at large too. And I think there was something called the Walking While Trans ban that kind of connects being transgender or this assumption that if you are transgender, gender nonconforming, walking on the street, you're equated with a sex worker. And only recently did New York repeal that type of law. So these laws are really pervasive, that have a deep cultural history. These are really outdated laws, and I think they can be further weaponized by the right today, where, of course, there were ill intentions decades, years, centuries ago. However, this kind of like biological essentialism, a man is a man, a person who is assigned male at birth will always be a man, and the same for women, for people who are assigned female at birth, is a very, like, only, I think in recent history, with knowing the right has never been not sexist, but I think in the past 5 years, that a lot of this stuff has been amplified, especially when young people are involved, because there is this moral panic of what happens if, your kid is transgender, and what are the ways that that's harming people in society as a whole, when, it's not really on a child to think of how society will be affected, but also it's not really, they're not really affected by that. So I guess of what I was trying to say is just, it's gotten particularly bad for gender variant youth.
Yeah, like I feel like with these laws criminalizing testosterone and overly regulating it, like I think I just see like a big parallel to a lot of drug laws and, broadly to drug policy in general, that like so much of the criminalization, like what drives it is kind of so much misinformed fear and just rampant, just kind of misinformation and all these lies spread about these substances. And like, it just seems like with testosterone, it seems like it's widely believed that like it, causes people to become violent and the same thing is attached to all sorts of other drugs. Like it's like, attaching, stigma, misinformation, fears of violence to these substances that then in turn drive the restriction of them. And so just like kind of zooming out here, there's just so many parallels where just a broader ecosystem of fear about these substances just feeds into their restriction and just really causes harm for people. And it's like, we can cite all the evidence that like there's no conclusive link between testosterone and violence, but like those kinds of things are still out there. And yeah, it just, conversations like this and articles like yours that debunk these harmful narratives are just sadly what's necessary to fix drug policy and to also, help change the conversation about, these transgender laws and all these harmful things happening. So thanks so much for doing the work that you're doing.
Thank you. And yeah, to go off of like that fear, talking about it more, I think the right and just trans exclusionary radical feminists, anybody who is in denial that trans people are real and here and valid, if we had gender affirming care that was truly equitable, it would be free and accessible to all. So that includes not just gender affirming hormone therapy, also includes the different surgeries and surgical procedures that trans people seek that are very expensive and generally unattainable to most. Because once people have access to gender affirming surgeries, what is the cultural norm of like what someone who is assigned male at birth, someone who is assigned female birth, and just this idea of like if your gender can change once or multiple times throughout a lifetime and you can go through different transitions, I think that is a scary thing for people who oppose the idea that you can change your gender because it is so fluid and it's not a fixed identity that people are used to, that traditionally, culturally, we're grown and taught to be true. So, unfortunately, that's what's driving a lot of this, especially adding to the violence that already exists. And in the future, informed consent model can be really great for places that require to see a mental health professional for 6 months, a year, however amount of time for a mental health professional to sign off and saying this person is the gender identity that they hold true to themselves. And a lot of the systems that we have in place are still very slow and lagging, and there's tons of room for improvement, which again, because the healthcare system was not designed for trans people in mind, much of like this legislation that we talked about or the laws that we talked about today in terms to the criminalization of testosterone.
Yeah. I mean, the healthcare system wasn't even designed with females or women in mind. It's really just for men. It hurts all of us, I mean, it doesn't even really benefit men in the long run because health is collective, it's not just an isolated thing. And I like the connection you were making to, moral panics and drug panics, because every drug panic is a moral panic. It's not based on evidence. It's not based on science. It's based on fear. Whether it's, that fentanyl can cause an overdose by touching it, or Narcan parties, or whatever, it's all the same sort of logic that somebody that just saw something on Fox News cooked up, and then a legislator picked up on that, and then we have to spend all of our energy fucking fighting it. It's exhausting. And I hope that it gets better. I really do, because I don't want to see more people dying from any of this stuff. From overdoses, from not understanding or not feeling understood. Are there any organizations that are fighting this that we can highlight?
There's a really great website compiled by journalists kind of capturing, you can look up what anti-trans legislation is in your state, where you can kind of see on a localized scale, like how it's affecting where you live in the United States. And I think there are state and local headed efforts, especially I think it's stronger in the South. Reconcile Arkansas is one of them, is a group that was founded by gender variant people. That's a great one. But I think nationally at large, let me follow up with you. Can we include some links for the show notes?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, We'll definitely put some links up there. Maybe to close out, we can plug you. Where can people find your work and find you online and follow the important coverage you're doing?
Yeah, you can find me at adryancorcione.com. You can also follow me on social media, on Twitter and Instagram at mixthem, MXTHEMME.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been a good topic, and I think we got to raise more awareness about this kind of thing, because it for cisgender people, it really is not something that they think about very often. I remember when I saw your article in Filter magazine in December, and I was like, this is a thing that's sort of in the back of my mind, but it's not like, we got to bring it to the forefront, because it's just like so many other aspects of the drug war is totally ridiculous, and it's actively harming people that are already marginalized. Like, let's make things a little less worse for them.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me on. I'm a big fan of the podcast, so it was really awesome to be a part of it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Yeah, so definitely look to the show notes for more information about testosterone criminalization and organizations work doing important work.
Hey, thanks for listening to Narcotica, an independent production by Christopher Moraff, Zachary Siegel, and Troy Farah. I'm your co-producer, Garrett Farah. If you like the show, you can find out more about us on our website at narcocast.com and support us by joining our Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/narcotica. There you can pick up some merch or request something like a shout out on the show. A little goes a long way, so thank you very much for helping us out. We are an ad-free program and we'd like to keep it that way. But if Patreon isn't for you, that's just fine. You can still help us out by spreading the word. Tell your friends about the show and like us wherever you get your podcasts. We're on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, all the things. Our theme music is by Glassboy. Jenny Shea is the voice of Narcotica, and additional music is by Poddington Bear. You can follow us on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook. Those are the best ways for you to contact us should you have a question or complaint or just want to say something nice. That's everything, guys. Have a good one.